Hi, everybody. This is Daniel Karapkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario, in Canada for webyeshiva.org. We've been studying Moreh Nevukhim for several years now already, and we are continuing in the third section of the Guide for the Perplexed. We are starting today, chapter 34. And the Rambam, of course, as we've been studying all along, is talking about the concept of mitzvot, why God gave us the commandments, ultimately to perfect us. And therefore, the Rambam, before he gets into the specifics of the various 613 commandments of the Torah, he's gone through some prefatory material, certain things that he wishes to lay down. And this chapter, chapter 34, that we're going to be learning today, is, again, a prefatory chapter to going through the specific mitzvot. I'm going to be sharing my screen at this point with the handout. And as we say every week, you can always download this handout in one of two places. One is the Facebook group Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim, or on webyeshiva.org in the course description for today's chapter. The title that we've given for this chapter today is that the Torah's commandments address the majority, not the minority. So let's see if we can make sense of this. Let's see. Okay. All right. The Rambam in the previous chapter, chapter 33, had instructed us that many of the mitzvot address pulling man away from his physical desires. If you recall, the Rambam had broken man's physical desires into two categories. One was for food and drink, the other one was for sexuality. And a large percentage of the mitzvot are dedicated to that project because a person cannot achieve the ultimate goal of humanity, which is intellectual perfection, if he is in pursuit of those goals. The chapter before that, in chapter 32, the Rambam had said that the reason for animal sacrifices was because, and we sort of emphasize these words, at that time, meaning at the time when the Torah was being given, the way of life generally accepted and customary in the whole world and the universal service upon which we were brought up consisted in offering various species of living beings in the temples in which images were set up. In other words, God wanted to pull us away from idolatry and therefore gave us sacrificial law to pull us away from those commandments. But it is important to look at those words at that time. And that seems to imply, which we sort of said outright when we studied chapter 32 together, that this indicates that certain mitzvot speak to certain eras more than others. The point of our chapter, therefore, is to underscore that despite the fact that there are different people and times change and circumstances change, the mitzvot are static and unchanging, despite their greater or lesser degree of applicability to certain times, places, and most importantly, to specific individuals. The Torah does not address, and this is where we just start the outline of our chapter, the Torah does not address exceptional cases, nor is it focused on the minority of situations. And what the Rambam wants to really, the theme of what he wants to point out to us in this short chapter, which in the Pines edition is on page 534, is that there are perforce going to be individuals within a Torah community who do not benefit from a certain mitzvah, even though that mitzvah is beneficial to the majority. Whatever the Torah wishes to engender by giving a commandment, be it an opinion to formulate a certain correct idea, let's say about God or about reality, or to produce within a person a moral habit, which means proper ethical behavior or moral behavior, or perhaps a useful action. Its objective is to address that which will work best for the masses and the majority of cases. This is so even if in exceptional cases, the Torah's laws will end up harming individuals instead of helping them. And that ultimately is true in any code of law that is built for an entire society. We all recognize that the law is beneficial to the overall benefit of the human beings comprising a society. Does that mean that every single law will be appealing and in the best interests of every single citizen of that society? No, not necessarily. There may be restrictions on the speed limit, but then there are very skilled individuals who can drive much faster and would benefit from going faster than the speed limit. But that notwithstanding, that person still will get a ticket, even if he's perfectly capable of weaving in and out of the cars without causing any harm to himself or to others. And the simple reason is that any kind of uniform law that's designed for more than one person has to be able to take into account what is beneficial for the most number of people. And if a certain minority of people don't benefit from that particular law, there's nothing we can do about it. But that's just the way that the world functions when we're dealing with a law that appeals to a group of people instead of individuals. Now, I just want to create an association to the previous chapter. Nachmanides, the Ramban, in his Torah commentary, has a very interesting comment on the idea of what it means to be holy. In our previous chapter, the Rambam had told us that the definition of being holy is to abstain from physical indulgences. And Nachmanides, looking at that commandment that the Torah gives us, Kedoshim tihiyu, you shall be holy, is that there is a recognition built into the Torah itself that the Torah's laws are designed to benefit humanity and bring a human being closer to the ultimate goal of the human being, which is to perfect oneself. According to the Rambam, it's intellectually. According to the Ramban, it may be spiritually. But the point being that the commandment of Kedoshim Tiyu, of you shall be holy, goes with the recognition that even if you observe all the commandments, you may fall between the cracks. And you may, as an individual, fail to see the larger picture of what the mitzvot are trying to convey. And you may end up not achieving the Torah's goal for humanity, despite the fact that you've observed the commandments. And therefore, the Ramban says that Kedoshim Tihiyu is meant, sort of this generic be holy, is never lose sight of the fact of the overarching goal of the Torah to elevate the individual and to make him realize his ultimate humanity. If you take a look at the language that he uses, he says, first he cites Rashi, who says essentially the same as the Rambam, that the definition of holiness is abstention from physical indulgences. He says, V'ha'inyan ki haTorah hizhira ba'arayot uv'ma'achalim ha'asurim. The Torah, however, we have to acknowledge, does curb our appetite for physical indulgence by telling us that we are limited to whom we may consort in the bedroom and to what we are allowed to put in our mouths by way of kosher food. However, v'hitira habia ish bi'ishto va'achilat habasar v'hayayin. But the Torah nevertheless permits us to consort with our legally married wives and to eat kosher meat and kosher wine. Im kain yimtza ba'al hata'ava makom liot shatuf bizimat ishto onashav harabot. And therefore, it is possible for a person to be a very committed Jew who abides by the halacha and yet completely give himself over to his physical desires by indulging with his wife or multiple wives, in theory, and to also become a glutton when it comes to eating kosher meat and drinking lots of kosher wine. V'yedaber kirtzano b'chol hanevalot shelo huzkar isur ze b'Torah. And furthermore, the Torah doesn't address all vulgar kinds of behaviors. So a person may say, well, it doesn't say explicitly in the Torah that I can't use certain kinds of vulgar language. It just says I can't curse God, and I have, but there's no sense of civility that is dictated by the Torah. V'hinei yihiyeh naval b'rshut haTorah, this very famous term that the Ramban uses. A person could become a vile person, or what other word could you use for a naval? A disgusting individual within the confines of the Torah, because he's completely lost the forest for the trees. He says, yes, I'm going to make sure that I observe every single halacha in Hilchot Nida and the laws of who I may marry, and all of the halachot vis-a-vis kosher food. I'll make sure that it's galat kosher. And yet the person will be given to absolute gluttony. Lefichach ba katuv acharei sheparat ha'yisurim she'asar otam legamrei, v'tziva b'davar klali sheniyeh prushim min hamotarot. And that's the reason why when the Torah says, be holy, it's essentially saying, don't indulge in excessive personal gratification. That's what it means to be holy as a catch-all. And so the Ramban is, in a sense, thematically consistent with what the Rambam is saying. The Torah is designed as a whole, as a holistic system to perfect the individuals. Are there going to be exceptions where people will fall through the cracks? And there are going to be certain situations and individuals where the mitzvah will not end up helping? Absolutely. And so that's the point I wanted to raise. Maimonides acknowledges that the efficacy of the mitzvot is limited by the very nature of mitzvot being uniformly given to an entire society. Not only will the mitzvot often not succeed in improving the individual, but even going further than what the Ramban is saying, that it's possible to become vile within the confines of the Torah, but sometimes even a mitzvah or mitzvot may even end up harming the exceptional individual, because whereas that mitzvah works and actually is helpful to most people, it actually is counterproductive to certain individuals. So thematically, they're very similar ideas. Next, the laws of the Torah are comparable in this sense to the laws of nature. Both laws come from the very same God. And essentially, the Rambam has used this idea before by telling us that nature and the laws of the Torah are very much related because they are created by the same God. The very same God who created laws of physics and laws of nature also created the laws of the Torah. And there's a certain parallel that exists between the two of them. Both of them sort of dictate how reality is supposed to function. The laws of nature dictate how physics works, how the elements work, how gravity works, how botany and chemistry work. Everything is built into these laws of nature. The Torah has a system of how humanity is supposed to function. And therefore, there are certain parallels. Even though there are certain rules of science, and by the way, this is very consistent with an Aristotelian worldview, that you can discover God equally, whether you look at the Torah or whether you look at nature. The Rambam has made a point of this many times, that the only way to properly identify God is both through a knowledge of Torah and through a knowledge of scientific reality. And that's really why it is so important for the Rambam for a Jew to have a comprehensive knowledge of all of existence, including the natural world and the metaphysical realm. Even though there are certain rules of science which dictate, and that's the whole idea of Ma'aseh Bereshit and Ma'aseh Merkava, that a person needs to engage in those areas of speculation, as we've been saying throughout. That's the undercurrent of the entire guide. Now, even though there are certain rules of science which dictate how each organism is meant to be formed, there are mutations and exceptions to these laws of nature that end up with an organism that has deficiencies despite the laws of nature. So, in the realm of frogs, every frog is green and has 4 legs and croaks. But there might be an exceptional frog that's born with 3 legs, or a mutated frog that's born with 5 legs. And so there are always going to be exceptions within nature, that even though nature functions, generally speaking, properly with a well-balanced ecosystem, nonetheless, there are individual components within creation that don't always work properly. You may have a meteor that falls from the sky and ends up causing damage. You may have tornadoes that form and end up wreaking havoc within a certain segment of society. Sometimes that's by the hand of God, and sometimes that's just because nature runs amok in individual situations, but overall, the system actually works quite well. Similarly, the laws of the Torah are meant to perfect people as a whole, but there will be some individuals from whom the law for whom the law does not make perfect. And a person may approach a particular mitzvah, say, and have the attitude that not only does this mitzvah not speak to me, but actually I find it to be something that if I were to indulge in this mitzvah, I feel it would end up harming me either psychologically, emotionally, and so forth. But he says both scientific law and Torah law are, as it says in Kohelet, nitnu mero echad, given from the same shepherd. And it is therefore impossible for this to be any other way. As the Ephodi explains, the physical realm is replete with flaw and defect. That's the way God built the physical realm. As a result, you find in nature aberrations and mutations that form the exception to the rule. That's just the nature that in a physical reality, there are going to be on the edges of that reality, there are going to be problems. There are going to be things that don't work and don't fit. In the same vein, by nature or by dint of the physical reality within which God gave the Torah to humanity, there are going to be cases that are individual cases and individual situations where the Torah's laws do not work in the way that they were meant for the overall majority. As we have already explained earlier in chapter 15 of this section, that which is impossible is permanently impossible and cannot be made possible at some point. And so a person can't hold out and wait and say, I look forward to a time when the Torah will speak equally beneficially to every single Jew. No, the nature of our current reality is such that just like in nature, there are imperfections and mutations, but overall the system is a good system. So too, the Torah system is a good system, even when certain individuals in certain situations do not benefit from the laws of the Torah. Now, the Rambam here makes a contrast. He says you have to contrast this with medical treatment that is given by a physician. And as he says, it is not possible that the Torah can be catered to individuals' unique circumstances and times. With medical treatment, each individual patient is prescribed a highly specific regimen particular to his specific ailment and physical needs. So a doctor can see a dozen patients on the same day. The first patient, he gives a high blood pressure medication. The next patient, he gives low blood pressure medication. The third patient, he gives a diabetic medication. And the fourth patient, he gives psychiatric medication. So all of these, every single individual who comes to the doctor is given a regimen that is unique and catered specifically to that individual, right? But the Torah doesn't work that way because the Torah is not a system whereby any individual can turn to God or the prophet of God and say, I want you to tailor a regimen that is specific to my needs, my personality, and what will help me grow spiritually. Now, it's quite interesting that despite this, and we're going to talk about this more as when we get to the end of the chapter, that the Torah is so multifaceted that it is possible for each individual to find his or her unique entree to that which is spiritually satisfying within the Torah. You know, I've often commented, and as the commentaries point out, that the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot says that Shimon HaTzadik says that there al shlosha devarim ha'olam hameid. The world stands on three pillars: Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim. Now, for some Jews, Torah study is their main focus and the thing that they feel perfects them the most. So they emphasize one aspect of the Torah's commandments and they de-emphasize other aspects of the Torah's commandments. But that does not absolve any individual from embracing the Torah as a holistic system. For other people, avodah, prayer, is the hallmark of their religious expression. And for other people, acts of chesed, ben adam lachavero, between man and their fellow man, acts of compassion and kindness, that's their expression. Each person within the Jewish structure of the Torah and its mitzvot is entitled to find a unique regimen of what is emphasized and what is de-emphasized. But at the end of the day, it's one holistic system of 613 commandments, and there's only so much latitude that is granted to the individual, such that if the Torah says you may not work on the Sabbath, one particular individual may find that to be very confining and stifling, but no exceptions are made for that person in contrast to a situation where a person goes to a doctor and the doctor says, in your situation, you need that which is contraindicated for everybody else. And I just want to ponder for just a minute. When the Rambam gives this contrast between the Torah's laws, which are more akin to nature, versus a physician's um, individually catered regimen of medical dispensation, does the Rambam also mean to suggest here that medical knowledge changes as we advance scientifically? Unlike the Torah, which must always remain static, there's a certain ambiguity in the language of the Rambam. Perhaps he also means to say that as society evolves, there are certain parts of the Torah that do not speak to us as relevantly as they did perhaps in previous eras. And that's where I think that this is a bit of a continuation, if we're reading it correctly, to chapter 32, where he says that the commandment for karbanot was given to mankind because at the time when the Torah was given, mankind was pursuing idolatrous rites and rituals that are similar to the sacrificial order. And as a way of pulling people away from idolatry, God gave us sacrificial rituals to use in the service of God. We don't bring korbanot anymore, and we don't have a temple. Is it? And so perhaps it's because korbanot do not speak to us as much. Is the Rambam perhaps suggesting that the Torah perforce is static and unchanging for all generations, but there are going to be times and places where certain mitzvot are more relevant and speak to people more as far as providing meaning in their lives, and in other times, perhaps. Conversely, the Torah's laws apply universally to all human beings and at all times, such that they cannot be catered to individuals. If it were attempted to cater the mitzvot to individuals, you would end up with multiple Torahs and the whole would be corrupted. That's the language the Rambam uses. And that is why the sages say, Natata devarecha l'shi'urin. We find this phrase, you've given the matter over to subjective measurements that are not uniform. This is the statement that the Talmud makes to say that you can't do that with the halachic system. So just to give you one example, when the Talmud discusses how many years a squatter must live on a property in order to take possession, because many times residence proves that you own the property, the Talmud says that it takes 3 years to establish what's called a chazakah, to show that you are the owner of a property upon which you are living. So the Talmud asks, why is it that 3 years establish ownership? If you've been living on a property for 3 years, you are considered its owner. The Talmud initially proposes the amount of 3 years based on how long it takes people to mind when a stranger is squatting on their property. In other words, sometimes people may be very patient and they may say, okay, so a homeless person moved into my unoccupied, vacant property, let him stay there. But if he's going to stay there for more than 3 years, then it's going to bother me. So therefore, the Talmud says maybe that's the reason. Up until 3 years, people won't protest. 3 years already, people, if they don't protest, it means they're willing to give up the property. The Talmud challenges this by saying that it depends on the individual, since there are some people who don't even want a stranger to take one step on their property. And if so, natata devarecha l'shi'urin, this is a subjective matter, because ultimately it's going to turn up that the halacha will basically depend upon the temperament and the sense of ownership of every single individual. Some people may not care if a squatter or a homeless person comes onto their property for a few days. Other people will say, I don't want someone in my property even for 5 minutes. And so how can you establish what makes a chazakah such that a person is deemed to be the owner based upon something that is so subjective and constantly changing? So therefore, the Torah's laws, just like nature, are uniform throughout and apply equally to all times and places, even if a minority of people are adversely affected. For this reason, the objectives behind the mitzvot cannot be altered based on time or place, but must be rather uniform. This is conveyed in the verse in the book of Bamidbar, HaKahal chuka achat lachem v'lager hagar. that the entire congregation of Israel must abide by one law, both for the natural-born Jew and for the convert. Chukat olam ledorotechem, and it must apply for all time. It can't just apply for one time. Kachem kager yihiyeh lifnei Hashem. You must always be the consistent and the same for both yourselves and the convert before God. And the law must be the same. Chuka achat lachem. It must be one law for you consistently for every person and for all times and places. Now, after having set forth the above premises, I will now get into explaining Ta'amei HaMitzvot. And so this is the final statement of the chapter where the Rambam says, over the last several chapters, I've tried to set up for you the whole objective of why God gave us the mitzvot, which ultimately is to perfect humanity within the individual, i.e., perfect his intellect so he has the most knowledge of God and his universe. And that's the key to immortality, and that's what we've been discussing throughout this section 3. Now, says the Rambam, starting with chapter 35, I will now break down the mitzvot and tell you how each mitzvah fits into that rubric, fits into that category. We're going to start chapter 35 next time with the discussion of how we can break down all 613 commandments into 14 different categories, each category fulfilling a different objective towards that project of making the individual into a perfected being. But before we leave you today, I want to present to you some points of consideration. First of all, I want to point out that the Rambam, despite the fact that he says that the Torah has to be a catch-all and is going to be the same for all people, he also allows for certain elasticity within the Torah in a later chapter. So we're just going to give you a preview of something that where the Rambam says in chapter 41, which we'll see in a few weeks, but there's one section that's easy to overlook, but if we don't append it first to what we've just seen in chapter 34. The Rambam here is talking about the rebellious elder, what's called the Zaken Moreh, one of the elders of the religious community who decides to dissent from the Sanhedrin's ruling. That person is treated harshly by the laws of the Torah. And in that context, the Rambam writes as follows. God knew that the judgments of the law, and here I'm using the Friedlander translation, that God knew that the judgments of the law will always require an extension in some cases and curtailment in others, according to the variety of places, events, and circumstances. He therefore cautioned against such increase and diminution and commanded, Lo tosef alav velo tigra mimenu, you shall not add or diminish from the Torah. In other words, God recognizes that there are going to be new eras. There are going to be new situations that arise in the evolution of society. There are going to be different attitudes and dispositions within mankind. And man at different points in world history is going to think that the Torah is archaic and anachronistic and doesn't apply to the present era. And that's why God, in anticipation of that sentiment, says, no, don't add or diminish from the Torah. It's perfect. It's a good system for all times and for all places. For constant changes would tend to disturb the whole system of the law and would lead people to believe that the law is not of divine origin. Now, with all of that stated, that the Torah must remain static, nonetheless, permission is at the same time given to the wise men, meaning the rabbis of the Sanhedrin, of every generation to make fences around the judgments of the law for their protection and to introduce bylaws in order to ensure the keeping of the law. And that is the reason why there is elasticity. You have rabbinic law that is meant to make certain changes to preserve the original Torah law based on the circumstances of the time. So for, perfect example, there used to be a concept that when men and women would come to the temple on the 3 festivals during the year, men and women could enter together into the courtyard of the temple, and intermingling of the genders was considered to be totally normal and perfectly fine. At some point, however, the rabbis during the Second Temple period noted that societal values were beginning to erode in the areas of chastity and sexuality, and therefore they created divisions to require women to be in one part of the temple courtyard and men to be in another part of the temple courtyard to create a separation of the genders. That's a fence around the Torah. And the Rambam continues and he says, such fences once erected remain in force for all time. The Mishnah therefore teaches, make a fence around the law. In the same manner, they have the power temporarily to dispense with some religious act prescribed in the law, or to allow that which is forbidden if exceptional circumstances and events require it. There are times that the rabbis can suspend a positive commandment. Now, there are obviously very severe limits placed upon this, but there are times, and we're very familiar with this idea, that the rabbis will sometimes tell us, even though, let's say, for example, on Rosh Hashanah, you have an obligation to blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, but if Rosh Hashanah coincides with Shabbat, you have to abstain from blowing the shofar. This is a perfect example that there are exceptional circumstances that require us to tell you not to do that which the Torah tells you to do. And furthermore, to allow sometimes that which is forbidden on a temporary basis if there are really exceptional circumstances. And this is where, for example, that Eliyahu Hanavi permitted the use of an altar outside of the temple on a very, very temporary basis. But none of, as recorded in the Book of Kings, but none of the laws can be aggregated permanently, as has been explained by us in the introduction to the commentary on the Mishnah in treating of temporary legislation. By this method, the law will remain perpetually the same and will yet admit at all times and under all circumstances such temporary modifications as are indispensable when they are necessary. If every scholar had the power to make such modifications, the multitude of disputes and differences of opinion would have produced an injurious effect. Therefore, it was commanded that of the sages, only the great Sanhedrin and no one else should have this power, and whoever would oppose their decision would be put to death. For if any critic were allowed to dispute the decision of the Sanhedrin, the object of this law would not be attained and would instead be useless. So it is therefore in that spirit that the Rambam says legislative powers were granted to the majority of the Chachamim, to the Sanhedrin, to make certain limited modifications, certainly to be more stringent, and sometimes even to tell us not to do certain mitzvot when the circumstance calls for it, not to permanently put an end to certain mitzvah practices, but on either a temporary basis or on very limited circumstances to not fulfill a mitzvah. We're not going to get into the technical aspects of this, but I do want to point this out because when you learn chapter 34 in a vacuum, it seems as if there is absolutely no plasticity whatsoever in the Torah's commandments. They must be practiced and embraced by every single Jew universally without any latitude whatsoever. And here you see the Rambam does acknowledge that times change, places change, people's attitudes change, and therefore certain latitude can sometimes exist within the elasticity of Torah. Now, I want to also point out that this requires us to really subject what the Rambam is saying to a lot of contemporary thought that we get into today about societal issues and societal values. Some examples of how the individual is compromised by the Torah, even when the majority is aided. So, that's what the Rambam says. A lot of times, an individual in a Torah community may be suffering from the existence of a certain mitzvah, even though it's beneficial to the whole. So, for the perfect example is the mamzer, which is often used by Jews who reject traditional Judaism as a way of sort of pointing a finger to the unfairness of the Torah. They say, look, the Torah requires chastity and prohibits certain forbidden relationships such as incest and adultery. And yet, look, there's an innocent byproduct that can come from an act of incest or adultery, the mamzer, the bastard, who cannot enter within the Jewish community and marry a regular Jewish partner. And that seems to be unfair. You're unfairly discriminating against this poor child who by no fault of his own was brought into this world through an illicit union, and therefore has to suffer for the rest of his life and be an outcast under normal circumstances from the rest of the Jewish community. The fact of the matter is, the laws of chastity, laws of arayot, which demand that a person not marry certain forbidden people in their purview, actually is for the benefit of the society as a whole, to generate that kind of holiness that the Rambam in chapter 32 was talking about. But are there going to be individuals who will actually suffer as a result of that particular mitzvah? Yes, absolutely. An extension of that is the story in Leviticus chapter 24 of the Mekalel, the person who cursed God, because according to the Talmud, that person was told that because his father was a non-Jew and only his mother was Jewish, he could not dwell with any one of the 12 tribes, but had to pitch his tent outside of the 12 tribes' encampment in the desert. And this he felt was a grave injustice. He wanted to become close to God, didn't want to be considered an outcast, and he felt it wasn't right. And that's what brought him to blaspheme and curse God, because he just said, this system doesn't work for me. And the tragedy is that you can't, even if something doesn't work for the individual, but if it's a holistic system that works for the entire populace with rare exception, then that's what makes the system a good system, even when individuals suffer from it. I didn't put this in the notes, but I think in our society today, there's so much emphasis on the individual, and that's what gets us sort of caught up with the seeming dissonance between the values of society today and the values of the Torah. Think about just sexual orientation. The homosexual is banned by the Torah. Homosexual activity is prohibited by the Torah. And yet there are people who, as individuals within a larger society, say, well, this doesn't work for me. So does that mean that the Torah is a bad system? No. The Torah prohibits certain forbidden relationships in order to engender holiness within a community, which we're not going to define now, but at least that holiness certainly restricts certain kinds of people that I'm allowed to consort with sexually. And it's true that it may not work for that specific individual, but it doesn't make the system a bad system, because overall it is a good system that works for the vast majority of society, helping to perfect them. I'm going to put that aside. And some areas of accommodation to the law when circumstances on the ground change. Of course, there's a lot that's been written and spoken about two examples that are in the Talmud. The Pruz Bowl, whereas even though Shemitah, the sabbatical year, cancels loans, Hillel, at one point in Jewish history, saw that people were abstaining from lending money. And therefore, he created a fix, so to speak, to allow for people to circumvent that law and to avoid having their loans canceled, which would incentivize people to once again lend money. Another example is the Eruv, which is a way to help us carry in public domains on the Sabbath, even though the Torah explicitly prohibits it. It is another legal loophole to take a domain which seems to be public but is not biblically public but is only rabbinically public, and to make an accommodation so that people can have an enjoyable Sabbath, especially those with children who would be confined to their homes if there wasn't such an accommodation made for them. So on the one hand, you see the absoluteness of the Torah, the inviolability and the static nature, the unchanging, immutable nature of the Torah, but at the same time, you see that there is some aspect of making accommodations when situations change. We cannot accommodate the individual, but we sometimes, through rabbinic legislation, can also accommodate changing situations within society, as long as the Torah as a whole is not tampered with. So much more to discuss, but that's the theme of today's discussion, and I'm going to hold it here. Let me wish you all a good week, and Bezrat Hashem will continue next time. Take care, everybody.